The most expensive mistake Claire Bennett ever made started with a joke about a man's hands. The morning sun had barely cleared the tree line when Ethan Walker rolled open the doors of his small repair shop on the edge of town. The familiar smell of motor oil, steel, and worn rubber drifted into the cool Ohio air. It was the kind of place most people drove past without noticing. The paint on the sign had faded years ago. The building itself was old. But every machine inside worked. Every tool had a place. Every customer knew they would get an honest answer. Ethan preferred it that way. He stood beside a delivery truck with the hood raised, his hands stained dark from a long week of work. Across the parking lot, his 10-year-old daughter Lily sat at a small folding table finishing a school project before class. Every few minutes she glanced toward her father. Not because she needed help. Because she liked watching him work. Ethan rarely spoke while diagnosing a problem. He listened. Observed. Thought. Then he fixed it. Around 9 o'clock, an unfamiliar sound cut through the quiet morning. A low, exotic engine note. Several customers looked toward the highway. Seconds later, a bright orange McLaren turned into the parking lot. The car looked completely out of place beside pickup trucks and work vans. It rolled to a smooth stop near the office. A woman stepped out. Claire Bennett, founder and chief executive officer of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the Midwest. Her face appeared regularly in business magazines. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to being the smartest person in every room. Ethan barely looked up. To him, it was simply another vehicle. Claire removed her sunglasses and glanced around the property. Her eyes paused on the aging building. Then on Ethan's oil-stained shirt. Then on his hands. A slight smile appeared. Not a friendly one. One of her assistants stepped from a following SUV and asked if there was somewhere nearby to get coffee. Claire laughed softly and pointed toward Ethan. "Maybe he can tell you," she said. "He probably knows every gas station within 50 miles. A few people chuckled politely. Ethan continued working. Claire looked at his hands again. "I have never understood how people live like that," she said. "Those hands look like they have not been clean in 20 years. This time the comment was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The parking lot became noticeably quieter. Lily looked up from her project. Ethan slowly set down a wrench and wiped his hands with a shop towel. He did not look angry. He did not look embarrassed. If anything, he seemed mildly amused. Claire waited for a response. None came. Ethan simply returned to the truck engine. The silence somehow made the moment more uncomfortable. Claire shook her head and walked back toward the McLaren. As she climbed into the driver's seat, Lily quietly watched from across the lot. Ethan noticed. He gave her a small reassuring smile. Nothing more. A minute later, the McLaren pulled onto the highway and accelerated away. The sound faded into the distance. Ethan returned to work. But less than 10 minutes later, a strange noise echoed from somewhere down the road. And before anyone realized it, the day was about to change completely. The sound came again 15 minutes later. This time everyone in the parking lot heard it. It was not loud. Not dramatic. Just wrong. Ethan looked up from the truck engine and glanced toward the highway. A moment later, a bright orange shape appeared in the distance. The McLaren was coming back. But it was moving slowly. Much slower than before. The engine note that had sounded so confident earlier now seemed strained. Uneven. Ethan watched quietly as the car rolled toward the repair shop. Several customers stopped what they were doing. Lily stood from her chair and looked toward the road. The McLaren reached the entrance of the parking lot and coasted forward. Then, without warning, it lost the last of its momentum and stopped completely. Silence followed. Claire Bennett stepped out immediately. The confident smile from earlier was gone. She pressed a button on her key fob. Nothing happened. She climbed back inside and tried again. The dashboard lit up. The engine attempted to respond. Then a warning message flashed across the screen. Another followed. Then another. Claire frowned. One of her assistants hurried over from the SUV behind her. "What happened?" he asked. "I do not know," Claire replied. "It just lost power." The assistant looked concerned. "Should I call roadside support?" Claire nodded. "Call everyone." Ethan returned to work. He had no reason to involve himself. Across the lot, several phone calls began immediately. Within 20 minutes, a luxury roadside service truck arrived. 2 technicians connected diagnostic equipment to the vehicle. They worked quickly and professionally. Claire stood nearby with her arms crossed while receiving calls from her office. The technicians checked system after system. Their expressions gradually changed. First confusion. Then concern. Then frustration. Lily noticed it too. "Something is wrong," she said quietly. Ethan wiped his hands with a towel. "Looks that way. Can they fix it?" Ethan glanced toward the McLaren. "Maybe." Lily narrowed her eyes. "That usually means no." Ethan smiled faintly. The first technician disconnected his equipment and spoke privately with the second. Both looked puzzled. A few minutes later, one of them approached Claire. "We are seeing multiple fault messages," he explained. "But none of them explain the complete power loss." Claire stared at him. "What does that mean?" The technician hesitated. "It means we need additional support." Another call was made. Then another. More vehicles arrived. More specialists stepped out carrying computers and testing equipment. The small repair shop parking lot slowly transformed into an outdoor diagnostic center. Customers watched with growing curiosity. Nobody expected a simple answer anymore. The McLaren sat motionless while experts surrounded it. Ethan continued repairing the delivery truck. Yet every time the specialists attempted to restart the car, he paused briefly and listened. Not stared. Not walked over. Just listened. Once. Twice. 3 times. Each attempt produced the same result. A strange hesitation hidden beneath the sound of the engine. Barely noticeable. Easy to ignore. Ethan returned to tightening a bolt. Lily watched him carefully. "You heard something, did not you?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the vehicle one more time. Then he reached for another tool. "Maybe," he said. Across the parking lot, the number of experts continued growing. Yet with every passing minute, the problem seemed to be getting worse. By early afternoon, the parking lot looked less like a repair shop and more like a technology convention. Additional support vehicles arrived from the nearest McLaren service center. Engineers stepped out carrying laptops, diagnostic modules, and specialized testing equipment. Customers who had originally come for routine repairs lingered nearby, curious to see what would happen next. Claire Bennett stood beside the motionless car, answering calls between conversations with technicians. Her frustration remained controlled, but it was becoming harder to hide. Every expert seemed confident when they arrived. None of them remained confident for very long. Ethan Walker continued working. He finished the delivery truck, handed the customer an invoice, and moved on to a generator that needed attention. To anyone watching casually, he appeared completely uninterested in the growing spectacle across the lot. Lily knew better. Every time the McLaren's engine attempted to start, Ethan paused for a fraction of a second. Not enough for most people to notice. Just long enough to listen. Around 2 o'clock, one of the senior engineers gathered the others around a laptop. Several screens displayed system readings, fault codes, performance logs, sensor reports. They discussed possibilities for nearly 20 minutes before trying another procedure. The result was exactly the same. The engine started briefly, hesitated, and then fell into another protection mode. The engineer removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another specialist suggested a software issue. A third believed it might be electrical. A fourth suspected a component failure. None of the theories matched all the symptoms. The deeper they investigated, the less sense the problem seemed to make. Claire listened to each explanation. Her patience was beginning to wear thin. "You are telling me nobody knows why a car with less than 4,000 miles suddenly lost power?" she asked. No one answered immediately. That silence said enough. Across the parking lot, Lily looked toward her father. "They still cannot figure it out." Ethan tightened a bolt on the generator. "Not yet." "Do you know what is wrong?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I know what I hear." Lily leaned forward. "And?" Ethan glanced toward the McLaren. "That is not the same thing as knowing what caused it." The answer only made her more curious. Late in the afternoon, another test sequence began. The engineers restarted the vehicle while monitoring live data. Ethan happened to be carrying a toolbox across the shop entrance when the engine fired. He stopped walking. Just for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly. There it was again. The same subtle interruption buried beneath the sound of an otherwise healthy engine. Small. Consistent. Almost invisible. The kind of thing most people would dismiss. Ethan set down the toolbox and looked toward the highway beyond the parking lot. Something about the pattern felt familiar. Not the exact sound. The behavior behind it. A memory surfaced from years earlier. A problem that had fooled experienced technicians because everyone had focused on complex explanations instead of simple ones. He said nothing. Meanwhile, another engineer disconnected his laptop and shook his head in defeat. Claire looked around at the growing collection of specialists surrounding her car. The confidence she had carried that morning was fading. For the first time all day, her eyes drifted toward the small repair shop. Toward the mechanic she had mocked. Ethan noticed her looking. Then he calmly returned to work. But as the afternoon shadows grew longer, one thing became increasingly clear. The experts were running out of answers. And Ethan Walker was not. The first person to approach Ethan was not Claire. It was one of the engineers. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot as the specialist walked toward the repair shop carrying a tablet filled with diagnostic reports. His expression showed the same frustration everyone else had been carrying for hours. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Ethan looked up from a hydraulic pump he was rebuilding. "Sure." The engineer glanced back at the McLaren. "You keep listening every time we start the car." Ethan wiped his hands with a shop towel. "Maybe." The engineer almost smiled. "That is what your daughter said you would say." Ethan looked toward Lily. She grinned from the office doorway. The engineer lowered his voice. "Do you hear something?" Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. Then he asked a question instead. "Have you checked the same systems more than once?" The engineer looked confused. "Of course." Ethan nodded. "And every test says something different?" The engineer's expression changed immediately. "How did you know that?" Ethan shrugged. "Because otherwise you would already have found it." The engineer stared at him for a moment before slowly returning to the group. Across the parking lot, Claire watched the entire exchange. An hour earlier she would have ignored it. Now she could not stop thinking about it. The specialists gathered around another laptop. New conversations began. More reports were compared. Yet the answers remained out of reach. The deeper they searched, the stranger the failure appeared. Every system looked healthy on paper. The car itself disagreed. As the sun moved lower in the sky, another restart attempt was performed. The engine fired. Ethan paused again. This time he closed his eyes briefly. Just long enough to isolate the sound beneath the sound. A tiny interruption. Consistent. Predictable. Almost hidden. When the engine shut off, he opened his eyes. The memory from years ago returned more clearly. A machine that had fooled an entire engineering department because everyone trusted the data more than the behavior. Ethan picked up a wrench and returned to work. He still said nothing. 20 minutes later, Claire finally walked across the parking lot herself. The conversations around the car faded as people watched her approach the repair shop. She stopped several feet away from Ethan. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. Earlier that morning it had been filled with confidence. Now it carried uncertainty. Claire glanced toward his hands. The same hands she had mocked. They were still covered with grease and oil. Nothing about them had changed. "My people cannot find the problem," she said. Ethan nodded once. Claire folded her arms. "Do you think you know something they do not?" Ethan looked toward the McLaren. "I think they are looking at what the car is saying." Claire frowned. "And?" Ethan set down the wrench. "Sometimes machines lie." The answer seemed to surprise her. Before she could ask another question, the engine started again across the lot. Ethan listened. This time a faint smile appeared. Not because he knew the answer. Because he finally knew where to look. And for the first time all day, the mystery surrounding the McLaren seemed just a little smaller. The engineer returned less than 10 minutes later. This time he was not alone. 2 senior specialists followed him across the parking lot carrying tablets and printed reports. Their expressions had changed. The frustration was still there, but now it was mixed with curiosity. Ethan was tightening bolts on the hydraulic pump when they approached. He looked up briefly and then continued working. One of the specialists cleared his throat. "The engineer said you might have an idea." Ethan shook his head. "I said you might be looking in the wrong place." The specialists exchanged glances. One of them held up a tablet. "We have checked every major system." Ethan nodded. "I believe you. Then what are we missing?" Ethan stood quietly for a moment. He looked toward the McLaren. The car sat surrounded by equipment worth more than most houses in town. Yet it remained completely disabled. Finally Ethan asked a simple question. "When did the problem start?" The specialist answered immediately. "About 15 minutes before the power loss." Ethan nodded again. "Anything unusual before that?" The specialists began reviewing notes. One mentioned a fuel stop. Another mentioned a brief warning that disappeared almost immediately. A third pointed out a software update completed several weeks earlier. Ethan listened carefully. Then he folded the shop towel in his hands. "There." The group looked confused. "There what?" Ethan pointed toward the notes. "You have 3 events." One specialist frowned. "Yes." Ethan nodded. "And everybody is treating them as one problem." The specialists fell silent. Across the parking lot, Claire noticed the conversation growing more serious. She slowly walked closer. Ethan continued. "What if they are not connected?" One engineer immediately objected. "The timing is too close." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe one issue is hiding another." The statement changed the atmosphere instantly. The specialists looked back at their reports. For the first time all afternoon, nobody argued. Claire stopped beside the group and listened. Ethan pointed toward the vehicle. Every time that engine starts, I hear the same hesitation. One specialist crossed his arms. The diagnostics do not show it. Ethan smiled faintly. That is why you are still here. The comment was not arrogant. It was matter-of-fact. The engineer who first approached Ethan looked down at his tablet. Then back at the vehicle. Then back at Ethan. If you were us, he asked carefully, where would you start? Ethan looked toward the highway for a moment before answering. Forget the fault codes. The specialist stared at him. Ethan continued. Forget the warning messages. Another pause. Find the first thing that happened before the computers noticed anything was wrong. The group became completely silent. Claire watched the mechanic's face closely. Earlier that morning she had only seen dirty hands. Now she was beginning to see something else. Experience. The kind that could not be downloaded, programmed, or purchased. The specialists hurried back toward the McLaren. New conversations erupted immediately. Different records were pulled up. Earlier data was reviewed. Previous assumptions were challenged. Ethan returned to the hydraulic pump. Lily walked over carrying a bottle of water. You told them something important. Ethan took the bottle and smiled. Maybe. Lily laughed. You always say that. Ethan looked toward the crowd gathering around the car again. Deep in the growing noise of experts rechecking their work, he sensed they were finally moving in the right direction. And if they were about to discover a clue nobody had been looking for. The clue appeared less than 30 minutes later. One of the engineers suddenly stood up from a folding table covered with diagnostic equipment and called the others over. Several specialists gathered around his laptop. Conversations that had filled the parking lot all afternoon immediately stopped. Claire noticed the change. So did Ethan. The engineer began scrolling through a sequence of system records that had originally been dismissed because they seemed unrelated. Now, viewed separately from the major fault codes, the information told a different story. The specialists compared timestamps, service logs, sensor histories, fuel data, software events. For the first time all day, a pattern emerged. Not one problem. Two. The first issue had appeared shortly after a routine fuel stop. The second had existed quietly for weeks without triggering serious concern. Together they created symptoms that looked catastrophic. Separately they were far easier to understand. Claire walked closer as the discussion intensified. What did you find? She asked. One of the engineers looked up. We think he was right. Claire followed his gaze toward Ethan. The mechanic was standing beside the hydraulic pump exactly where he had been before. He had not moved toward the McLaren. He had not asked for attention. Yet somehow the entire investigation had shifted because of a few simple observations. The engineer continued reviewing data. A contaminated fuel batch had likely created temporary performance irregularities. Annoying but manageable. The second issue was far more interesting. Deep inside the vehicle's control systems, a software calibration inconsistency had slowly developed after a recent update. Alone, it was nearly impossible to notice. Combined with the fuel issue, it triggered a chain reaction of protective responses that eventually caused the power loss. One specialist shook his head in disbelief. That should not have happened. Another nodded. And nobody would have looked here because the fuel contamination distracted us. The realization spread through the group. Hours of confusion suddenly made sense. Claire looked toward Ethan again. This time there was no trace of the confidence she carried that morning. Only curiosity. The specialists immediately began implementing corrective procedures. New fuel was sourced. System parameters were reviewed. Software settings were compared against manufacturer specifications. The atmosphere changed completely. Earlier they had been guessing. Now they were verifying. As sunset approached, another engine start was attempted. Everyone stopped talking. The engine came to life. Smooth. Strong. Healthy. Yet Ethan remained silent. He listened carefully. The specialists monitored screens. Numbers flowed across displays. Data stabilized. One engineer smiled. Another exhaled with visible relief. But Ethan still listened. The engine continued running. The hesitation was gone. The tiny interruption hidden beneath the sound all day had disappeared completely. Only then did Ethan nod once to himself. Lily saw it immediately. "You heard it," she said. Ethan smiled. "I stopped hearing it." The answer confused her for a moment. Then she smiled too. Across the parking lot, the specialists prepared for a road test. Claire stood beside the vehicle watching every step. Hours earlier she had mocked a man because of the condition of his hands. Now the most qualified experts around her were discussing insights that originated from those same hands. As the McLaren rolled toward the highway for its first test drive since the failure, every person in the parking lot watched. And for the first time all day, nobody was looking at the car. They were looking at Ethan Walker. The road test lasted nearly 20 minutes. Nobody left the parking lot while it was happening. Customers delayed appointments. Technicians postponed repairs. Even Claire's assistants stopped checking their phones. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the stretch of highway disappearing beyond the trees. The longer the McLaren stayed away, the quieter the crowd became. Ethan returned to cleaning tools inside the shop. To everyone else, the road test felt like the most important event of the day. To him, the answer had already arrived. The engine either carried the hesitation or it did not. Everything after that was confirmation. Lily sat on a stool near the garage entrance watching the road. "You are not even worried," she said. Ethan smiled slightly. "No. How can you be so sure?" Ethan placed a wrench back onto its rack. "Because machines do not care about opinions." Lily tilted her head. "What does that mean?" "It means they either work or they do not." Before she could ask another question, the sound of the McLaren returned from the distance. Heads turned instantly. Conversation stopped. The orange car appeared on the highway and accelerated smoothly toward town. No hesitation. No warning lights. No struggle. Just clean, uninterrupted performance. The specialists exchanged looks of disbelief. One engineer actually laughed from relief. The vehicle entered the parking lot and rolled to a stop. The driver stepped out with a grin that had been missing all day. "Everything is normal," he announced. "Full power. No faults. No protection modes. Nothing." A wave of excitement moved through the group. Several specialists immediately began reviewing fresh data. Others repeated measurements to verify the results. Every number matched. The problem that had consumed an entire day was gone. Claire stood silently beside the car. For a long moment she said nothing at all. She watched the engineers discussing findings. She watched customers whispering among themselves. Then her eyes moved toward the repair shop. Ethan was standing exactly where he had been before. Not surrounded by people. Not giving instructions. Not claiming credit. Simply putting away tools as if nothing extraordinary had happened. One of the senior engineers finally walked across the lot. This time everyone noticed. The specialist stopped in front of Ethan and extended his hand. "You saved us hours. Maybe days." Ethan shook his hand politely. "You found the problem." The engineer smiled. Only because you showed us where to stop looking. Several others joined him. Questions followed. How did he recognize it? What sound had he heard? When did he suspect multiple failures? Ethan answered briefly. Never more than necessary. The more he spoke, the more impressed the specialists became. Not because his explanations were complicated. Because they were simple. Years of experience had allowed him to notice what layers of technology had hidden. Nearby, Claire listened carefully. Earlier she had seen a mechanic with dirty hands. Now she was hearing highly trained experts discuss him with genuine respect. The contrast was impossible to ignore. As sunset painted the sky orange and gold, the crowd slowly realized the biggest surprise was not that the McLaren had been repaired. The biggest surprise was that the quiet man everyone had overlooked understood the situation long before anyone else did. And for Claire Bennett, that realization was becoming harder to forget with every passing minute. Most of the crowd had gone home by the time the last diagnostic equipment was packed away. The sky above the repair shop had turned deep blue, and the first evening lights were beginning to appear along the highway. The specialists thanked Ethan one final time before leaving. One by one, their vehicles disappeared into the distance. Yet Claire Bennett remained. Her McLaren sat quietly near the office, fully functional once again. Ethan was sweeping the garage floor when he noticed her standing near the entrance. She seemed different now. Not less confident. Just more thoughtful. Lily had already finished her homework and was helping organize tools. She looked back and forth between them with obvious curiosity. Claire stepped forward. Can I ask you something? Ethan leaned the broom against the wall. Sure. Claire glanced around the property. The aging building. The worn concrete. The old sign above the office door. How long have you owned this place? Almost 12 years. Claire nodded slowly. And before that? Ethan hesitated. A lot of different jobs. That answer normally would have ended the conversation. This time it did not. Claire studied him for a moment. Those engineers treated you like one of their own. Ethan smiled faintly. They are good people. That was not what I asked. Ethan looked toward the highway. Experience comes from a lot of places. Claire folded her arms. You make everything sound simple. Most complicated problems start simple. The answer lingered between them. Later, after Claire stepped away to take a phone call, one of her assistants approached Lily. He smiled politely. Your dad is impressive. Lily smiled back. I know. Has he always fixed things? Lily laughed. Everything. The assistant looked toward Ethan. Even cars like that? Lily considered the question. Especially things people say cannot be fixed. The assistant smiled and walked away. An hour later, Claire found herself sitting alone inside her vehicle before leaving. Instead of starting the engine immediately, she opened her phone and searched for Ethan Walker. At first she found almost nothing. Then a few older industry articles appeared. One mentioned a manufacturing facility years earlier. Another referenced a technical award shared among several engineers. A third described a difficult equipment failure that had cost a major company millions until a small team solved it. Ethan's name appeared quietly in the background of each story. Never in the headline. Never seeking attention. Yet always present. Claire read every article she could find. The more she learned, the more uncomfortable she felt about that morning. Not because Ethan had proven her wrong. Because she realized how quickly she had judged someone she knew nothing about. She looked through the windshield toward the repair shop. Ethan was locking a storage cabinet while Lily carried a small box toward the office. They looked happy. Not wealthy. Not famous. Just content. For reasons Claire could not fully explain, that image stayed with her. Before leaving, she stepped out one final time and walked toward Ethan. He looked up as she approached. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Claire took a slow breath. "I think I owe you more than a thank you." Ethan studied her expression. For the first time all day, there was no status between them. No title. No assumptions. Only honesty. And Ethan already knew what she was about to say. Claire stood quietly beneath the fading evening light. The parking lot that had been crowded all day now felt almost peaceful. The highway hummed softly in the distance. Ethan waited without saying anything. He had learned long ago that some conversations arrived only when people were ready for them. Claire looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "This morning, I judged you before I knew a single thing about you." Ethan remained silent. "I looked at your hands and decided I understood your value." She shook her head slightly. "I was wrong." The words were simple. Honest. There was no audience left to hear them. No cameras. No executives. No engineers. Just a mechanic, his daughter, and a woman finally willing to admit a mistake. Ethan nodded once. "It happens." Claire almost laughed. Most people would not make it sound that easy. Ethan glanced toward Lily. Holding on to things gets heavy after a while. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Lily stepped closer to her father. Claire noticed the girl's expression immediately. Pride. Complete trust. The kind that could not be purchased or manufactured. Claire looked back at Ethan. "You could have embarrassed me today." Ethan shrugged. "Why?" "Because I deserved it." Ethan smiled faintly. "That would not have fixed your car." The answer stayed with her. After a moment, Claire extended her hand. Ethan looked at it and shook it. There was no dramatic music. No celebration. Just mutual respect. The kind earned rather than requested. A few minutes later, Claire climbed into her car. The engine started instantly. Smooth and strong. Before leaving, she lowered the window. "Thank you, Ethan." Ethan nodded. "Drive safe." The McLaren pulled onto the highway and disappeared into the evening. Silence returned. Lily looked up at her father. "You knew she was going to apologize." Ethan locked the toolbox and smiled. "Maybe." Lily laughed. "You always say that." Together they finished closing the shop. The last customer had gone home hours earlier. The tools were back in place. The workbenches were clean. Another ordinary day was ending. Yet somehow it felt different. As Ethan switched off the final light inside the garage, Lily slipped her hand into his. They started walking toward home beneath the orange glow of the setting sun. Halfway across the parking lot, Lily looked up at him. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Were you upset when she laughed at your hands?" Ethan looked down at his fingers. The grease stains never completely disappeared. Years of work had made sure of that. He smiled. "Not really." Lily seemed surprised. "Why not?" Ethan glanced back at the shop one final time. "Because these hands built everything we have." Lily smiled. "I like them." Ethan laughed softly. "Good." They continued walking. Behind them stood the same small repair shop most people overlooked. The same aging building. The same faded sign. Nothing about it appeared extraordinary. Yet the people who had been there that day would remember it for a long time. Not because of an expensive car. Not because of a famous executive. But because they had witnessed something easy to forget in a world obsessed with appearances. Real value does not always arrive wearing a suit. Sometimes it arrives with dirty hands, a quiet voice, and the wisdom to let actions speak for themselves. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Ethan Walker walked home with his daughter, carrying nothing except a lunchbox, a set of keys, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing exactly who he was.